In this video, I'd like to give a quick analysis of the poem "The Hosting of the Sídhe" by William Butler Yeats, composed around late 19th century. Yeats is obviously he's the most famous Irish poet, one of the most famous in the world. Many think he's the best poet in the world. This is a poem he wrote from a book called The Celtic Twilight, which was a series of reflections on people in Sligo and how they were living, and it was basically a book designed to describe how the light of the Celtic ancestry of the Irish was kept alive in these Western peasantry, and how it was dying, hence Twilight. Now, this poem itself is relatively short, and it has two main themes in it, which both come from Irish folklore. One is on Slua Shi, which is the Irish version of the Wild Hunt, or Asgard's I'll talk about that in a bit. And the second is of the last of the Fianna. These were the last cycle of the heroic pagan Celts from Irish folklore, stories told in medieval times. And it focuses on the character of Cialte, who was the last of Oisín's band after Oisín had gone to the Otherworld. And, well, to talk about how the poem itself is structured. First two lines, the host is writing from Knocknarea over the grave of Cluth na Bear. This describes two different places in Sligo. Knocknarea, or Knocknarea, the Hill of the King, is a mountain in Sligo, on top of which a Neolithic cairn has been built. Many believe it's a passage tomb due to the typography, but it hasn't been excavated. If it is a passage tomb, it's one of the older passage tombs in Ireland, and this is actually the largest structure built by human beings before the pyramids of Giza, and it was one of the earlier passage tombs on the west of Ireland, as opposed to one of the newer ones, say Bruna Boyne in the Boyne Valley, which is a later Neolithic tomb. In folklore, this tomb is called Queen Maeve's Cairn, because supposedly Maeve, Queen of Connacht, was buried there after she was defeated in the battles in the raids of the brown bull of Coolna. Now, Cluth na Bear is a corruption of Cailleach Vera and the Witch of Barra. Barra was a lake in Sligo, and so these are two different places in Sligo. Supposedly, the story is that this witch was one of the Sídhe, and she threw herself into the lake after finding it was the deepest lake in the world, because she wanted to get rid of her immortality, and she wanted to die, basically. If you follow the host riding over the grave of Cluth na Bear, they're riding over this lake, right? So it's implying that they're airborne, they're in the air, like the Wild Hunt. They're riding from the top of the mountain from the grave, the cairn. And these passage tombs were openings to the underworld, and at various liminal times you can travel through them. So when it says later in the poem, the host is riding twixt night and day, again, this is like they're riding through the liminal phase between night and day, through the twilight, where the realms between the dead and the living cross over, and so you can cross through the worlds of the dead and the living. The most obvious tradition of this was in Samhain, which is Halloween today. It was Icha Hauna, just the night of that celebration on what is today, the start of November, start of winter. And in this tradition also it was the Celtic New Year, and you could again travel between the realm of the dead and the living, hence the traditions of Halloween with ghosts and ghouls. And if you follow this path from Knocknarea over Cluth na Bear, you're getting towards the ocean. And so the premise here is that the Slua Shi are riding to the otherworld from the graves, from the underworld where they are. Now, I need to explain who the Sídhe were, and again about Irish, the Irish otherworld. So the Sídhe, translated as fairies from sí, meaning a fairy, but these are less like pixies or something from Peter Pan, and they're more like it's more like a sort of Night of the Living Dead type scenario. They're more like gods, the undead pagan gods coming back to the world. And in Christianity, that they were called demons. These sort of creatures. In the Germanic tradition, again, Odin was the chief of the Wild Hunt, and so they would collect people to bring them to the other world, basically. Often this would be done in the sense of being challenged to fight, or sometimes they would just take them, kidnap them, and they'd bring them to the other world. What this other world was in Irish mythology, it's basically the Irish version of Elysium in the Greco-Roman tradition. It's not a place where the dead go when they die, so to speak, but rather it's another magical world where the gods live, where you can, where some of the gods are from, where you can go through conquest and spiritual tribulation. You can transcend death and then go to this other world, which is a land of immortality and eternal youth. The actual underworld in Irish mythology was Tecton, which was was under the ocean rather than under the ground, but it was still the ancestral underworld, as opposed to say a place where you go through conquest. So it was more like Hades than Elysium. And in the Germanic tradition, you'd get a Hell and Valhall, and those would be the two places. But in all European mythologies, you get this dichotomy. Now, it says, Cielce tossing his burning hair, Niamh calling him away. Again, the idea of Cielce tossing his burning hair, it's his thoughts are aflame in his mind, as he's contemplating whether to stay in the land of mortals or whether to leave to the other world. And as Niamh says in the poem, she says, "Empty your heart of its mortal dream," implying that Cielce himself was a demigod like Oisín, and that he belongs in the other world with the rest of his band. And then of course Niamh describes the scene of this Sluagh calling Cielce away. It says their arms are waving, their breasts are heaving, their lips are apart. She describes anyone who comes between, anyone who looks upon their rushing band. They come between him and the deed of his hand. They come between him and the hope of his heart. So, in other words, the will of the people living on Earth, in the world, can be taken away, can be transcended or superseded by the desires of these fairies of the Sídhe, and that they can take your fate and change it into something new. They have that power over fate, which human beings themselves don't necessarily have. And so one other thing I need to describe is the story of Oisín and Cielce. This is one of the most famous, if not the most famous, stories about the Fianna, where after Cach Gabhra, after the Battle of Gabhra, Oisín is then approached by Niamh, or Niamh Kin Or, as she's called, Niamh of the golden hair. A kin is genitive of Cian, which just means a head. So her head is gold, like she has blonde hair. And most of these Sídhe are described as having blonde hair of some kind. It was seen as godly in some way. You look at Fionnuala in the story of Tanbo Culna, or in Lú Lámhfhada, he's also described as having blonde hair. Most of the gods are, in fact, whenever hair is described, breasts as well, is the same thing. Um, this story of Tír na nÓg was really a metaphorical story about the death of paganism. Oisin went to this land to rescue the daughter of a king who had been enslaved by a troll or a monster, a Fomorian. They were the giants in Irish mythology. And after killing the giant for Bullach, he spent 3 years there with Neve and had children there. So when he returned to Ireland, Ireland had been Christianized, and all of his friends were dead, and paganism had disappeared. And so he was the last of the Fianna. And then the story continues with his speech with St. Patrick, which is quite a common thing in Irish mythology, St. Patrick speaking to pagans. But it's a story. So Ciaillte is basically the last mortal Fiann, basically a singular Fianna. And he's being called away. So he has the choice of dying as a mortal with everyone else, or else living for eternity but leaving Ireland. And the basic idea of this story is that the last pagans, the last pre-Christian Irish are still living in Tír na nÓg, in the descendants of Oisin are still living in the land of eternal youth. You can find similar stories in Norway about I'll talk about that another day, perhaps. Those similar stories. So yeah, and also later in the poem it says, and